Welcome to our Sound for Video session. Today is the 9th of February, 2019. Question and answer session. We're jumping right in. First of all, from Mark. I've been away from the sound mixing field for a few years, so your videos have been terrific refreshers. One of the things we didn't do when I was first working as a location sound mixer was hopping to cameras wirelessly. I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit about the best way to do this and the best tools to use. I'm thinking of utilizing my old G3s as a way to facilitate this. What do you think? Well, Mark, that's a great option. We actually had a previous session where we talked about that with my friend Greg Palmer. You can see that over here. We'll put a link for that down below as well. So yeah, you can use your wireless systems, your G3s from Sennheiser, to transmit from your mixer to the camera. And there are a few little nuances. You want to read the comments down there too. Sennheiser wireless systems they're TRS connectors that they're using, the little 3.5 millimeter connectors, but they're wired a little differently than most other 3.5 millimeter connectors. So make sure you read the comments as well. Somebody who left a comment there talked about the nuances of that. So with all that information, I think you'll find that hopefully helpful. So thanks for that question. Next up from Trevor. What's the best microphone for filming a concert in an arena, but won't be close to the stage? I won't have much choice for this next concert as it is tomorrow night. I will be using a combination of two wireless lavalier microphones, RODE filmmaker kits placed in a couple of spots throughout the stadium, and my RODE NTG2 at the camera. I will have to sync and blend the audio files in post, as I can only do two inputs to the camera directly via the XLR adapter and with a third mic recording to a Zoom H4n Pro. This is something I don't do a whole lot of. There are a ton of different microphone options out there, but we did have an interview with a fellow by the name of Mike Stranks. I'll put a link for that down below. He does live recording of concerts in most cases, and so he may be able to he has some good ideas there in terms of different microphones to use. I would say that pretty much any small diaphragm condenser microphone can do. Generally, I would choose two of them in a stereo array of one sort or another. But those are some different things that he talks about, so I would definitely refer you to that. That's a pretty deep topic. I hope that's helpful for you, Trevor. So thanks for that question. Now, you're probably going to think I keep referring you to different videos, and in these first few questions, yes, we have covered a lot of these topics in a little bit more detail. We also have some new ones here today as well, so don't despair. Next up from Cornell, I often run into a problem of having a lot of unwanted background noise whilst recording videos at one of my clients' base. The office is behind a paper-thin wall to an industrial warehouse where they're doing welding, cutting, grinding their trucks. Besides sound treatment, it's not really feasible at the place and budget of the job to fully cover the rooms. Is there a way of reducing the unwanted noise by recording a separate channel of just an ambient mic and subtracting it from the main recording? I use Omni Lavs from the RODE Filmmaker kit and or a shotgun mic and a RODE NTG2. There is some software that may help you with that. So to answer your question, yes, there is a way to do that where you take an ambient recording and you can use that to help reduce the noise a little bit. It's a product by Acusonus called ARRI. It's part of their Pro bundle, and you can see a demonstration of that here at this link. However, I would say there are inexpensive ways to help reduce some noise. We've talked a lot about sound blankets on the channel, and I realize, yeah, you can't permanently attach that stuff, but you can temporarily do it potentially. And if you can't afford sound blankets, which actually are fairly affordable, you can get moving blankets, which will help some. And you can just get those at a hardware store. I mean, I've seen them at my hardware store for about $15 for a pack of 5, I think it was. So that's relatively affordable. Then you can hang them on stands. Century stands are the best. If you can put the boom arm as sort of a T pattern, drape the blankets over that, attach them with spring clips, raise them up. You can get a lot of really good sound isolation that way. So that's an idea. I don't know what your options are there, but it's a good question. It's something we all run into. And I would say the blankets are the best way to do it, but if you have to do it in post, this plugin is worth looking at. Ideally, you use a combination. If the blankets don't do the entire job, then use this as well. I don't like relying on software to solve all my problems because oftentimes it's too late when you find out that it can't necessarily solve the problem in certain situations. So just some thoughts there, Cornell. Good question. Dejan, I'm not sure how you say your name. Apologize for that. But you talk about room tone, and I suppose that should be recorded with the same microphone as the dialogue. But what if you want to do a little more than just having a patch to mend any holes during the editing process? What if you have interesting sound effects on location that you would like to record? would you use mid-side recording? Yes, in fact, actually we've talked about this a little bit too. The effects I record separately at the location, but not at the same time that we're capturing the dialogue usually. I usually record those as wild lines, if you will, or just a sound effects recording after we shoot the film, or after we shoot that scene, or before if we have time to do it and we know it's going to be in there. So I do them separately because that way then I can mix them in and control how loud they are in relation to the dialogue and fine tune the sound. So yes, that's a great thing to do. Would I use mid-side recording? If I'm trying to create a sort of spatial ambiance, then yes, I would. Do I do that regularly? No. Mid-side recording, well, you evidently know what it is, so that's good. If you're familiar with it, then yeah, that can be a really great way to do ambiance. I don't generally use that for sound effects. With sound effects, I record them in mono because then I can, if I am doing any sort of a surround mix, or even if I'm just doing a stereo mix in post, I can then pan it wherever I need to put it. So I can automate that pan too. So I can make it sound like it's moving across the scene or whatever I need to do. So those are some thoughts there. Mid-side recording, I generally will reserve for recording ambiances personally. But that's one thing you can do. So thanks for the question. Hope that was helpful. Next up from Alex, I've been doing concert video recording in a small to medium jazz clubs, and I'd like to know if you have a suggestion regarding stereo microphones for that kind of shooting. And currently you use Rode Stereo Video Mic X, but it's too wide for the scene, so it catches everything around. Now I'm buying a Sennheiser MKE440, which should be more relevant to that kind of shooting. I wonder if you know of a better stereo mic to catch jazz band music. You record with the Mix Pre 10T. You're aware of recording from a soundboard, but that's not always possible. Yeah, well, and also recording from a soundboard isn't necessarily ideal either because the mix you'll get off the soundboard is optimized for that room, and so it sounds really weird when you're listening back to it on headphones or whatever, usually. I'll send you over to Mike Strengths as well for that interview that we did with him. Again, he does more of that. He has some microphone recommendations, so I would definitely take a listen to that. All right, next up from Jim, there's something I like to verify before making a purchase. I have a Zoom F8n and a Panasonic GH4. Can I simply send the time code from the Zoom using a BNC cable to the GH4 3.5mm audio input, or do I need something like a tentacle sync to get the time code out of the Zoom into the GH4? Jim, good question. There's not a direct way using a BNC to 3.5mm TRS cable to send the sound from the Zoom F8n because the Zoom is sending out a line level signal and the GH4 has a microphone level input, so it's going to be way too loud. The signal coming off the Zoom is going to be way too loud. It'll just clip and it won't work. You could use an attenuation cable, but that's kind of a wonky, it's a workaround. Some people may disagree with me on that, and that's fine. I don't like to use a lot of adapter cables. If I start getting to a point where I'm using a bunch of adapter cables, my sense is that I'm running the risk of them pulling out, especially if they're not locking cables. On the GH4, it's not a locking cable. Any attenuator cable you get is not going to be locking either. So there are just a couple of potential breaking points you have there. So I would probably use something like a tentacle sync. That would be my preferred solution, but you could potentially use a BNC to 3.5mm timecode cable. You have to make sure some of them are unit directional, so you want to make sure you're getting it so that it goes from BNC to 3.5mm TRS, and then you can use an attenuator cable from there. I wouldn't recommend that approach, but you might be able to get it to work. So thanks for the question, Jim. All right, next up from David. I purchased a remote audio BDS V4U and a 98 watt-hour battery with cables for my sound devices Mix Pre 10T, but I need a cable for my GH5. Okay, let me give you a little background information for people who don't understand what he's talking about here. The remote audio BDS V4U is a battery distribution system generally made for bag use for sound mixing bags. And usually what you do is you can hook one battery up to it and it will power your recorder, mixer, and your wireless systems and anything else you have in the bag as well. So from a single battery. And you just swap out that single battery. Makes things a little bit lighter weight and easier to manage in some ways. Of course, it also just puts you down to one battery power source. So anyway, that's what that is. And then you're asking if you have a GH5, your camera, and you have the Panasonic dummy battery coupler and AC converter. So this is a way to power your GH5 camera with AC power. and you're not sure which cable, if one exists, that you can use to go from the DC female port on the BDS, so the battery distribution system, to the female receptacle on the dummy battery coupler. Well, let's go take a look at something. Unfortunately, I think the answer is no. That I don't know of a way to do that, David. Let me just show you a little something here. Let's pull up. Okay, by the way, here is the wireless hop video with Greg Palmer, which I think we've talked about. Here's the recording live concerts with Mike Stranks. And here's the Acusonus demonstration we did. All right, battery coupler. So this is what it looks like. So you put this in the battery slot on the Panasonic GH5, and then you also have this AC adapter. And you're trying to get rid of this and instead use the battery power from your battery distribution system. The trick is, we'll come back to this, this outputs 8.4 volts, this AC adapter. So you need 8.4 volts. The problem is that your battery is probably a 14 volt battery. So you would need some sort of transformer. I'm not aware of a off-the-shelf solution for that, unfortunately. So I don't know of an easy way to do that. If you know someone that is handy with electronics, or you yourself are, you need to convert that power down to 8.4 volts, 2.5 amps, and feed it into, and then get the right DC barrel size to feed into the coupler, and on the other side into the battery distribution system. So unfortunately, I don't know of a way to do that. I wish there was a happier answer for you, David. It's a good question. It'd be cool if you could power everything with a single battery, but I don't know of a way to do that, unfortunately. All right. This is more of a philosophical question from Harut. My question, why no one can produce best recorder microphone overall 50 years? Everything is typically the same, not any other revolution. So I think what you're asking here is, why does it feel like there's not very much technological progress in the sound recording world? And I think it depends on your perspective. If you talk to some of the people that have been doing sound recording for film and video for a long time, I think what you'd hear them say is that the amount of technological revolution and advancement that there's been in this field has been tremendous. Now, there is one thing to consider. Let me draw an analogy from the camera world. A lot of people that directors of photography and enthusiast filmmakers that are shooting artistic-like films, for them, one of the things that they often say is that the lenses you choose are one of the most important things. And if you're going to buy something, it's more important probably to invest in lenses than in camera bodies, because camera bodies keep new ones are coming out all the time. But if you can get a really good lens and invest in that, you can use that over several different camera bodies over time. And that's roughly equivalent to what we call transducers in the audio recording and playback world. So a microphone is a transducer. It's taking waves in the air, sound waves, and converting them into an electrical signal. We don't see as much revolution in the transducer world. Now, there are new microphones coming out all the time, and they're finding, I think, less expensive ways to build them. They're finding ways to make them smaller and things of that nature. But we've had the ability technologically to make fairly good transducers for quite a while. So yeah, I agree with you. We're not seeing necessarily massive changes in terms of transducers, but in terms of recorders, we're seeing some awfully big changes. So I think that there definitely are some things there. Now, also this whole concept of best recorder or best microphone, I don't like to think in those terms. Best is relative. It depends on what you're doing as to what's best, and it also depends on you and how you like to work. So I flatly suggest to you, there's no such thing as a best recorder. There's no such thing as a best microphone. Even if we were looking 150 years in advance from today, and the technology continues to march forward, I still don't think there's a best, because we're still up against the laws of physics and the limitations they impose. So, excuse me. So those are just some thoughts, Harut. I think there definitely has been a ton of progress in the recorder world. I do think there's been some progress in the microphone world too. We're seeing much smaller microphones now, which makes a huge ergonomic difference, and makes some huge differences in what it takes to hide those lavalier microphones on people, holding them out on the end of a boom pole. We're also starting to see some pretty massive and interesting changes in the audio processing world. So even in real time, Sheps makes a microphone, a shotgun microphone, that does digital processing of the audio it's capturing to reduce the noise, the ambient noise. And that's its Super CMIT microphone. There's also, what's the name of the other technology, the other company that makes these hardware noise reduction? I don't remember what it's called now. In any case, there is some progress being made in those realms as well. So there really is a lot of progress made in the audio world. As far as audio interfaces that connect to your computer that we use for playback in post, I think we're seeing some tremendous improvements there as well. So for example, here I have a universal audio Apollo interface. I can do so much with that that I before would take a lot of hardware in the analog world. So that's pretty cool as well. Now, speakers are another things that are transducers. They're just going the opposite way. They're taking an electrical signal and turning it into sound waves. That's another good place to invest because that's something that will last for a long time, and we've had pretty good technology there for a long time as well. Are we making progress there? I think we are. I think we're seeing some of the more innovative companies, at least on the higher end, making some pretty good progress, and you'll start to see that come down market at some point as well. So for example, on the recorder end, if we can go back to that end, the Zoom F8 and the Zoom F8n and the Zoom F4, these recorders here, are doing things that would have required a $5,000 mixer and recorder in the past, and not very many years ago. So we're definitely seeing some significant progress in there. So I guess, Harut, it's a good question. I can understand your perspective, but I would also say we are definitely getting some forward momentum, and I think the technology is improving quite dramatically. So, all right, next up from Mike. Here's a question I've been pondering for a while. Although volume normalizing is generally suggested to be the last step in your audio workflow, I find that even with a clean denoise early in my workflow, once I normalize to -16 LUFS, my noise floor becomes less than ideal. That is to say, it seems like you're hearing more noise. If you are not submitting your video to an organization requiring rigid broadcast standards, are there any disadvantages to denoising as the final step in your workflow? I find that it rarely alters my overall normalization by more than a few tenths of a decibel. All right. That is a fine question. Let's just use an example here. And Mike, I would first of all say there are no hard, fast rules. You can do it wherever you want to do it and whatever works for you, and that's completely fine. Here's one warning I would give you about doing noise reduction as a last step. What I notice is that when I do noise reduction, let's just do a quick pass on this one right here. Not that there's a lot of noise, but you'll notice it changed the waveform a little bit, and what it did is it made the waveform a little bit more asymmetric. What I mean by that in practical terms is the peaks on the top here are at are closer to zero than the peaks on the bottom. It made them more asymmetric, more than they were. Here's before, and here's after. So what that means in practical terms is I go to loudness normalize it, watch what happens. Boom. We've clipped here on the top. We're not anywhere close to zero on the bottom yet. So I've lost some headroom. And that's one of the reasons I'd prefer not to do the denoising at the end, because you're losing headroom. So that means now I'm no longer in compliance. I'm actually clipping now. So I have this one clip point. Now, this is not that bad. And in fact, if we let's look at our loudness here. Pull it up. It's measuring this. We're at -26. If I have to get all the way to -19 or 16, well, I'm mono, so -19. This is -20. It's pretty close. Look at all the clipping I've done. So I'm going to have to do more compression. Anyway, so that's the first thing to consider. Now, I'm not here to suggest that you can't do it later in the process. I actually do normally. I will see, so when I just brought this recording in off my recorder, it's sitting at -35 LUFS. I would actually bump that up to like -20, at least -27. Get it into the 20s. And then I adjust my volume, and I'm going, this is kind of like I'm doing a manual normalization. You obviously don't want to do this as your final piece, but this is now sitting at minus 27 LUFS. If I turn the volume up on my monitors or my headphones, I should be able to hear that noise like I'm going to be hearing it pretty close to when I do the loudness normalization. Now, it's not going to be perfect, but you can already start to hear it. But I do that first loudness normalization step on each of the clips to kind of get them into the same realm. Then I do my processing, my compression, whatever else. And actually, in this case, I would also do, I'd fix that asymmetric problem that we're having here with the waveforms by using, in RX here, I have this phase module, and I use the adaptive phase rotation. When I do that, you can see now it's symmetric. So this is peaking at -4, and this is close to that as well. So it's made it much more symmetric, so that way I can loudness normalize. And in fact, you can see now I have 3 more decibels of headroom here. I could even bump this up to maybe minus, let's go to 25. And I'll still have a dB of headroom there. So that's one thing to consider. So what I mean by that in practical terms is if you're going to do noise reduction, it's best to do another round of adaptive phase rotation afterwards to make things resymmetric, to make them symmetric again. I don't think resymmetric is a word. And then do your loudness normalization. So in terms of order of operations, typically what I do is I'll do a phase rotation. I'll bump the loudness overall up to something in the 20s, usually around 25 or 26. Then I'll do my noise reduction, and then I'll do my compression, EQ, all that. I actually may do EQ early on as well if I'm trying to do a high-pass filter and things of that nature. So anyway, I feel like I'm rambling here, but there are some things to consider, Mike, when it comes to the order of operations and whether or not you should do noise reduction as the final step in your workflow. If you're still in compliance with the target you're trying to hit, I know you're not trying to submit it to a broadcast organization that has any strict requirements, but if you're still at -1 to 1.5 dB true peak and you hit your loudness target, that's fine. You can do that, but that's the risk, is that you can make those waveforms a little bit more asymmetric and you could start to clip. So if you are going to do it as the last step in your workflow, make sure you measure your loudness and your true peak again before you decide it's finished. So, all right, Mike, thanks for that question. Olivier, do you have any book recommendations about audio, field recording, studio, interview, documentary, film, etc., from beginner to advanced to professional? I do. I have a bunch of Dead Tree books right here. I'm going to show them to you. First of all, I like the Location Sound Bible by Rick Veers. I don't know if this is focusing on that, if you can see that. The book's a little bit dated. I think it was published probably almost 10 years ago now. 2012. And I don't know if a new edition's coming, but Rick Veers was a location sound mixer. I think he still does a little bit of that. I think mostly what he does now is he records sound effects, but this is a really good overview of location sound recording. He covers a lot of good topics. The main thing that's outdated is the talk about recorders. And if you're looking for specific information about what recorder you should buy or what microphone you should buy, you're probably better off looking at more recent information. But in terms of the overall process and the skills you need and things of that nature, this book is fantastic. And he has kind of an interesting sense of humor. I enjoyed it. Some people may be turned off by it, but I liked it. His second book, called The Sound Effects Bible, I'm in the process of reading this one right now. This is good if you're wanting to get into sound effects recording. And again, great book. It's really meant more as a reference. I'm actually reading it from cover to cover, but you can just use it as a reference. And again, same thing here. This one I think might even be older. So it's not something you want to rely on necessarily for the latest information. Yeah, this is 2008, excuse me. So this is a bit older. But it has really good information in it in regards to the skills and techniques and the general idea of how to record sound effects. So definitely worth looking at. Next up, we have Dialogue Editing for Motion Pictures. This is by John Purcell. He's an Emmy winner. This book is okay. It seems to me a little bit long-winded for what he's trying to cover. And it seems like there's a lot of chatter. So it's not quite as direct at getting to the point, I didn't feel like, but I would say this, I'm not highly recommending it, but if you really, really want to get into dialogue editing and really, You're going to be working on narrative films that are feature-length films, and you really want to understand the dialogue editing process. This is a good book for that. Next up, we have The Practical Art of Motion Picture Sound by David Udall. He's worked on 140 motion pictures. I haven't finished this book, and there's a reason why I haven't finished it. But it talks about a lot of stuff. I mean, it's older too. It comes with a DVD or a CD. I don't even know if I have anything that could read that these days. This came out in 2012. Clearly he knows what he's talking about. The thing that was a turnoff to me about this book was that the tone that he used. It almost felt like he was trying to prove how awesome he is. And for me, it was like, and maybe I misread that. I don't know. I didn't make it through the whole book, so maybe I'm not really a good person to make this judgment, but I was just turned off by the tone. But this covers a lot of different stuff. This covers not only production sound, but also some post. It is definitely dated, and it's definitely talking about a film recording world. So there's a lot of stuff that is not relevant today. It's not bad to understand that historically. But again, I think we need a new edition. This is 4th edition. I don't know if he's going to come with new editions, and it's going to talk more about a completely digital workflow. Or if that's his aim, maybe he'd still want to talk about the film workflow. It's cool to have that perspective because I never shot in that world. But in any case, there's some thoughts about that one. I'm not saying don't buy it. I'm not saying it's a bad book. Those are my impressions. Next up, the Sound Reinforcement Handbook. This is actually not directly related to film. Sound reinforcement, for those that haven't heard that term before, generally refers to the engineers that do live sound reinforcement. That is to say, they have a mixing board and they have amplifiers and they have speakers to amplify a live performance. That's technically what this one is for. This is the 2nd edition. This is very engineering. This gets a little bit hardcore into a lot more theory, a lot more electronics. For example, here I have a bookmark I was reading up on. Let's see, it talks about windscreens and pop filters, shock mounts, frequency response, acoustical and electrical characteristics of microphones, masking effects and equipment interaction, dynamic range. It's dense. If you don't have an engineering background, you might feel lost pretty quickly. I know I don't have a really strong engineering background or electronics background, but I've been able to follow most of it, but it takes a lot of effort, a lot of mental effort. Nevertheless, there's some thoughts there for you, Olivier. Those are the main books I have looked at. I've also read some mixing books from the music world. They're not as directly relevant to the film world, but there are some of those, and I think we'll go into those another time. So, all right, next up from Nick, I have a Sound Devices 633 and 2 Timecode Systems UltraSync 1s. Those are timecode generators. If I'm working on a single camera project, would it be better to use one UltraSync 1 on the camera and one on my Sound Devices 633? That is to say, the UltraSync would be sending timecode to the Sound Devices and have them sync wirelessly, or just use one and jam sync it to the Sound Devices 633's internal timecode. Well, Nick, you could do it either way. It's up to you. I think the benefit of using 2 UltraSyncs is that you have one as a master clock feeding timecode to the Sound Devices, and then it's also wirelessly transmitting to the UltraSync that you have attached to your camera, so they won't drift out of sync over the course of the shoot. So it's especially useful if you're doing longer shoots. But you can do it the other way too. You can just jam sync one of them to your Sound Devices and then attach that, disconnect it from the Sound Devices, attach it to your camera, and that'll work fine as well. So you won't have the wirelessly resyncing all the time benefit, but you could potentially get longer battery life in that UltraSync one because it's not doing all the wireless work. So that's one thought. I guess those are the trade-offs. Next part. Also, while we're talking about timecode, can you explain those super expensive timecode slates? What info do they display when clapped? Is that something a sound guy typically provides, or is that the realm of the camera department? Well, let me tell you what, first of all, they do. Okay. Here we have the ambient recording ACN LS Locket Slate modular timecode slate and display. So this comes in at about $13.50 US. It is a typical whiteboard slate that you can write with dry erase on, but it also has this LED display that displays the current timecode. So this is a timecode generator, and it has a massive LED display that's showing the current timecode. It shows it all the time, and then when you clap the sticks, what happens is in the frame, when the post people are editing that video, if for some reason the camera didn't record timecode to its timecode input, you would have a visual reference for the timecode. So you would look for the frame where the sticks come together, and then you would have a display of the exact timecode for that time. Then you can go to your audio files, get that same timecode value, find the timecode, that timecode moment or frame within the audio, and you can manually sync them up. So that's if your timecode input fails in some way, your timecode generator runs out of battery. It's just a kind of a safety thing. In the olden days, they used these before we had a lot of, more affordable, smaller, lighter weight timecode generators. And so that was the way that a lot of the syncing was done. So that's kind of my understanding of these digital slates with timecode generators built into them. Now, who provides them? That depends on the production. If you're working on a large budget production, it's usually the camera department that provides them. However, if you are working on a low budget production, oftentimes the camera department, in my experience, doesn't even remember to bring a slate at all. And so I always bring one just as a backup in case they don't have one, and we've used it a ton of times. So if you're working, again, when I say big production, I'm talking about Hollywood productions. It's going to be the camera or a union production. Technically, it's the camera department that is responsible for bringing that. But I like to be safe. I would at least have a dumb slate, just a basic whiteboard slate with you at all times in case something happens and you need to have something on hand. All right, thanks, Nick. Kevin, does it matter what setting I use for recording audio if I'm rendering out an H.264 video? That is to say, if you're going to do any sort of video that's going to the web, does it matter what sample rate you use? So here, for example, on my render settings in Premiere Pro, render the audio out in AAC at 48 kilohertz or 48,000 hertz. Same thing. So is there an advantage to recording the audio at 96 kilohertz 24-bit or 96 kilohertz 16-bit? Wouldn't it be better to just set the recorder to use 48 since that's what's being rendered? Well, if you're just recording dialogue, yeah, definitely. 48 is what I almost always do, even on the paid jobs that I do, which are generally going to be, I'm doing the location sound where I'm recording dialogue, and almost always I record at 48 kilohertz. So yes. When the time I bump up to 96 kilohertz sample rate is when I'm recording sound effects, especially if there is any chance that I will be slowing those sound effects down for some reason. So playing them back at a slower rate, because then I have that extra sampling to do instead of having to rely on as much interpolation and downsampling. So those are my thoughts. So generally, yeah, for dialogue, 48 kilohertz is fine. And especially if that's what you're going to be rendering out at. I would avoid for those, and this will come up a little bit later, I think, 44.1 kilohertz is probably not recommended these days. I know that was the old digital CD standard, and a lot of music services still stream in 44.1 kilohertz, but if you're going to do anything with film at some point, 48 kilohertz is still the standard, and I would generally record at 48 kilohertz when you can. Just so you don't run into any issues of sample rate conversion issues in the entire pipeline of recording to post to distribution. So it doesn't come up a lot, but it is something to consider. And there's not a lot of cost in terms of the overall amount of space it's going to use. So it's not an issue of, 48 kilohertz sounds better than 44.1. Very few people can tell the audible difference. But if you are going to be doing anything with video, I would recommend you stick with 48 kilohertz whenever you can. All right, thanks, Kevin. Next up, Aaron, what are microdot lavaliers? Deity now sells them at a cheaper cost, but are they worth it, and how do they compare to other wireless systems? All right, we're heading back over to the web here. We're going to look at a few things. All right. Microdot lavaliers are just lavaliers that don't have a built-in connector for a specific wireless system. So, for example, here's a Voice Technologies VT500 lavalier microphone, a very good one, by the way. I like this microphone a lot. I have two of them. It has a microdot connector, and let's get in closer so you can see what that looks like. So this is a microdot connector, and what that means is that instead of as I use different wireless systems, they all have different input connectors. And so instead of having to commit to that when I buy my lavalier, which type of connector I'm going to use, I can use microdot and then just buy a series of adapters. So I can use it with any wireless system. So I can use a 3.5 millimeter, 3.5 millimeter locking. Here's a 5-pin LEMO, it looks like, or TA5F. Here's a full-size XLR. Here's a TA4F. So they're all these wireless systems use different types of inputs. And what this does is it makes it easier for you to adapt your microphones to the type of wireless system you're using. So that being said, look at the prices on these adapters from DPA, $100, $115, $100, $100. This is something else. Don't look at that. In any case, you can see they're all in about the $100 range until you get down to the Deity connectors, and then they're more in the $30 to $40 range. So Deity is coming in, and it looks like they're trying to disturb this part of the market a little bit. I think that's great. So hopefully that gives you a little background on what microdot is and what it's useful for. So it's solving a practical problem, and that is adapting your microphone to a different type of input on a wireless transmitter. That's all it is. It doesn't mean it's better or worse. It's just adapting your microphone to work with a different wireless system. So there we go. And is it worth it? Yeah, I would well, that remains, I mean, that's an open question. We had, if you have to send your microphone back in to get it rewired for a different wireless system, that can be expensive. But there was somebody that left a message recently on one of our Sound for Video sessions. I'll have to go back and look that up. But in essence, they found a place where they could do it for $25 per microphone. So that's even less than this, but you're still committed then. Now you've rewired it to a different system. And if you're going to go back to another system, you have to rewire it again. These adapters, you can just screw them off and screw a different one on. So I prefer microdot if you can. They can be a little bulkier, but I really like the idea of microdot, and I like to see Deity come in and make that a little less expensive than it is currently. So that's the background on that. All right, next from Ali. In some interviews, the person moves a lot and changes his distance to the mic constantly. What I do is I level the auto manually and then take a sample for denoise from the spot where the background noise is the loudest and apply it. Most of the times, I couldn't figure a way to do the leveling with the compressor because there's a dramatic shift in the levels. Do you have any recommendations to make this process easier for me? I absolutely do. And in fact, generally, I would not use compression for that. All right, let's go back to our initial state on this. So here's some audio straight out of a recorder that's a little bit uneven. Now, it's not quite as uneven probably as you're describing there, but let's just show you here. There is a plug. This is Izotope RX, by the way. We're going to talk a little bit more about this later. Here is a module called the leveler. And what I can show you here is I'm going to apply this leveler and watch what it does. Watch what it does to the waveform. It's kind of evened it out. So again, here's before. Made it a tiny bit louder, but also the peaks that don't stand out as much, the overall body is a little bit more even. And in fact, if I show you the clip gain, you can see what it did. It actually manually went in and changed the gain throughout the course of the waveform. So that's one tool you can use. This is an Izotope RX. And let me just show you. Izotope RX comes in 3 different flavors: Elements, Standard, and Advanced. If we look at the comparison, let's see if the leveler is in all 3 of them. The leveler is only in the most advanced one, unfortunately, and that's a pretty expensive package. But that is one thought I have. I think there may be some new things in Audition. I need to go back and look at that. But if you can ideally get some sort of leveling plugin, that's going to be the way that will make that a little bit easier on you. Obviously, you'll want to fix that in production while you're recording if you can, but obviously if you're already past that and that's not an option, a leveler is one thing you can use. All right, next up is a question from Carrie. This is my brother. Will the new version of Alexa come with a bracket to hold a boom pole? Alexa op boom. I'm not answering that. Next up from Ethan. Hey Curtis, I'm a high school student really interested in sound. We use a 633 sound devices, and I was wondering if you could provide details about how the fader and trim switches correlate. I know the fader is for fine tuning, but I don't understand the decibel readouts. Okay. I think the first thing to consider when you're talking about trim or gain versus a fader is they actually do different things in my mind. I think of the trim or the gain trim or the gain, which are all, let's just say in this case, they all mean the exact same thing, is what you use to decide how much you're going to amplify the input signal from a single microphone on that channel. That's what gain does. What the fader does, on the other hand, is the fader takes the sound that's already been amplified by the gain trim and it allows you to choose how much of that microphone channel you want to send to the stereo mix. That's all it does. So that's, for me, the best way to think about that. So normally your fader, you would leave at 0 dB, unless for some reason you want to pull that out of the stereo mix a little bit and you would fade back. But the gain trim you want to set first. So actually what you want to do is you want to put your fader to 0, generally, and then you'll set your gain trim so that your peaks are hitting in the area where you want them. So normally it's going to be, in my case, on a 633, I'll normally aim for minus 24 to minus 18 dB. I take that back. Actually, on the Sound Devices 633, which has more of a dBu meter, I'm generally aiming for 0-ish, maybe a little bit lower than 0, just so that I have some headroom and can adjust things. So once you start recording, generally, unless things go really out of control, generally I'm not adjusting the gain trim at that point. I just leave the trim where it is, and I'm just using the fader to adjust how much of that microphone is being sent to the stereo mix. So hopefully that helps a little bit. The decibel readouts are a little different. Yes, on the 633, again, it's a dBu meter instead of a dB full scale meter. A lot of digital devices, fully digital devices, consumer devices in particular, will have a dB full scale meter. So 0 is the max. On a dBu meter, 0 is not the max. Actually, it's usually, I believe, more in the like plus 18 or plus 24 range. So 0 is still leaving you plenty of headroom. So that's some kind of background on that, Ethan. I hope that helps you a little bit. All right. I think you say Wojciech. Apologize if I got that wrong. I have a quick question about order of operations when processing dialogue audio. In what order do you do the following operations? Voice denoise, compression, EQ, and de-essing. We've talked about that a little bit already, but let's look at it in more detail. So I'm going to undo this, and I'm going to turn off the clip gain. Okay, we're back at our initial state. Okay, so let me just tell you, first I often do this phase rotation, adaptive phase rotation, to address any sort of asymmetry in the waveform. And I often find asymmetry in the waveform on men's voices. Not all men's voices, but a lot of them. And it's not just from poor quality microphones. People will tell me this all the time. Oh, it's just because you're using a bad microphone. No, some men's voices do this on all microphones. I have used $10,000 microphones, and my voice still produces, through that microphone and through a very high quality recorder in a recording studio, will still produce asymmetric waveforms. It's just a reality of the quality of some people's voices. So first I'll do that to even these up. And then, as I mentioned before, I may do my initial stage of loudness normalization. So here, for example, I'll probably bump this up to minus 28 or so. And that's when I would then do my voice denoising. Now, actually, before any of this, before we go any further, I might actually do some EQ. So if I look at the spectral waveform here. This is actually a pretty good recording, but if I had a lot of energy, this orange color down in the sub 100 hertz range, I would roll some of that off with a high pass filter in the EQ. So I would actually probably apply some EQ here just with a high pass filter. Watch what happens when I apply this. See, it cleans up down below 100 hertz pretty nicely. So that would be the next thing I would do. Then I would start working on other things. So EQ for sweetening sound. I often do that after I do compression. And the reason for that is that when you compress audio, you actually you can potentially change the timbre or the tonal quality of the audio. It can change the way it sounds. And so that's important for a couple of reasons. Number one, if I'm going to do some sort of EQ to do not to just solve a problem like use a high pass filter, but actually to make the sound better in some way. And I might apply some cuts. So I might cut a little bit here between 200 and 300 hertz. And I might, I don't know, do something like that. You'll see some stuff like this a lot of times to sweeten voices. I do that after the compression again because the compression is going to change the way it sounds anyway. So I'd rather do that first and then do whatever I'm going to do here. The interesting thing is, depending on the type of EQ you use, some of them will create some of that asymmetry again. And so after you do your compression to get your loudness where you want it, and then you apply EQ again, it may throw the symmetry out of whack again, which again, as we talked about earlier in this episode, could mean that you then have less headroom. So I'll do the compression, then I'll do the EQ. I will also do the de-essing after I do the compression because if I can show the spectrum, let's actually show the spectrum here. Okay, you can see here, the loudest stuff here actually is the bass. So if I apply a compressor and say I set the threshold to -60, you can see I'm basically only affecting the sound at about 2 kilohertz and below. That's really all I'm pushing all of the sound that's below 2 kilohertz down in amplitude a little bit, making it quieter, if you will. But I'm not affecting this stuff. So once I've flattened this out, once this is closer to this 60 or -60 line here, and I push all of it up because, again, I'm compressing so that I can just managing those peaks so that I can now loudness normalize the entire thing, increase the amplitude of everything. What happens then is suddenly these sit higher in the mix relative to the bass. And the sibilants and the essing sounds that you get are up in this range up here. So what that means is that they become more prominent. So essing and sibilance becomes more prominent once I've done my compression and loudness normalized. So that's why I do the de-essing after I do the compression, immediately after I do the compression, to kind of bring that back into control. And then I would probably apply the EQ for sweetening. I would do some de-breathing. And let's see if there's anything else you were asking about here. Those are the main things. So that would be the order I would go in. So I do a first round of loudness normalization. I would do my adaptive phase rotation. I would do my voice denoising. If that threw things out of whack in terms of symmetry, I'd do another round of adaptive phase rotation. I'd do my compression. If I need it, which I often don't, I would do some EQ for sweetening. And I'd do the de-essing. And then I'd do de-breathing. And then I do my final loudness normalization after that. If I needed to, if things got out of whack again in terms of the symmetry, I would do also another round of the adaptive phase rotation. So it sounds complex. Usually I don't have to do all those steps. I very rarely do EQ for, if I have a good recording that I'm working with. I don't do a ton of EQ, so that isn't usually a step, but almost always I do. I actually don't do a lot of voice denoise if I don't have to. When you start getting on location and you don't have as much control, then obviously you have to do more of that. But in any case, there's an overview. Hope that was helpful. I feel like I'm talking too much and it's making things more complicated. Next up from Mark, I use the RODE NTG2 to record into a Zoom H5n and it is great sometimes and others has room noise and buzz. Do you suggest upgrading to an NTG4? I can't afford the NTG3, which is so popular. Mark, no, I would not recommend that. That will not solve your problem, is my best estimate in my experience. I have both of those microphones. I've worked with the H5. Actually, I think it's just the H5. I don't think there's an N version yet. But the problem is this. The NTG2 has a relatively weak output signal, and the Zoom H5n has relatively little clean gain that it can supply. It can do some gain, but not a lot. And so that combination is just not a great combination. The problem is the NTG4 doesn't solve that problem. Its output signal also is not that great. It's not very hot. It's not very strong. So that would not probably be the best solution. To be honest, you'd probably be better off saving up and buying a better recorder that can provide more clean gain. I also don't like the sound of the NTG4. The copy I have, at least, is very mid-range focused, and it doesn't sound great on a lot of voices. So I don't love that microphone. The NTG2 is not perfect, but it's a pretty good microphone for the money. So I actually prefer it over the NTG4. The only thing is you need a recorder, something like a Zoom F4, that can provide more clean gain. Now, you can find the F4 on sale sometimes. I think it's about a $450 recorder at this point, or maybe that's the sale price. I'm not sure. But the NTG4 is close to that price anyway, so I would much more recommend a Zoom F4 as opposed to buying an NTG4. Now, that should take care of the buzz. If there is actual sound in the room that's making noise, again, sound blankets. Go get some sound blankets. That's the best investment that a sound person can make. And there are so many people that just avoid that and try to clean things up in post and try to buy more expensive microphones. People, that is not the answer. Get sound blankets. It will do more to help your sound than buying a new microphone or buying a new recorder. So that's what I was talking about in terms of getting the Zoom F4 is going to take care of more of these buzz issues, unless there's a buzz in the room. If there's a buzz in the room, then you need to eliminate the buzz somehow. So if it's if it's a fan from a computer, turn the computer off. Or if you can't, then find some way to isolate it somehow with a sound blanket or some other soft material that's going to reduce its overall, the amount that's going to get into the microphone. So hope that helps, Mark. I feel like I'm being this. Anyway, I'm not going to talk about that. Maurice, you probably have not had this question before. I'm over 70 and still do a lot of audio, video work. I know my hearing is not as good as it once was, especially at the higher frequencies. I've used Audition to generate many frequencies and can tell higher frequencies are less audible. Since my ears are the best tool to make sure I have a good audio product, here's what I'm looking for: a good tool to assess my hearing at different frequencies and a tool to adjust or boost frequency ranges real time so that when I listen to the audio that I'm editing, I hear it like my clients with good hearing would hear it. All right, Maurice, I actually have some experience in this realm. I have experienced some hearing loss in one of my ears. And I'm not 70 yet, but I'm on my way. And naturally, people lose some of their ability to hear higher frequencies as they age. In fact, most people over the age of about 25 cannot hear above about 17 kilohertz. People, once they get to 40, most can't hear over about 15 kilohertz, unless it's super, super loud, like dangerous level loud. And so I'm going to take a detour, and we'll come back to your question in just a second. For those of you that are spending time in loud environments, and in fact, I was just at an event last night where I didn't remember to bring my hearing protection, and it was super loud. I would highly recommend that everyone invest in a set of ear protection. So here, for example, is a company that makes, they call these high-fidelity musician earplugs by Heroes. I have a set of these, and I use them when I go into really loud environments, and it protects your hearing, because once you lose your hearing, you lose it. It's gone. As far as I'm aware, there are no magic ways to bring your hearing back after you've lost it. And so protect your ears. So that being said, let's go back to where we were talking to Maurice here. Okay. So I have some hearing loss. First thing I would recommend in terms of assessing your own hearing, I would go to an audiologist. And it's worth the investment. It can be expensive, I realize that, but it's definitely worth the investment. So I would highly, highly recommend it. They have the equipment. In my case, when I went to the audiologist, they put me in a room that was highly acoustically treated. They had a special set of headphones that are made for assessing your ability to hear. They send a variety of tones, and you have to, raise your hand if it's on your left ear, or your right hand if it's in the right ear, and they send it at different frequencies at different levels, and they can get a good read on where your hearing is suffering. So that's the first thing. If you want to just assess, that's probably the best way I know of to do that. I don't know of any tools to, in real time, adjust that in your playback system. And that's a tricky thing because so for example, some people would say, well, get hearing aids. Well, I actually had a pair of hearing aids prescribed because of that hearing loss. And honestly, the hearing aids that are out there are mainly just optimized for helping you to be able to hear other people talk. And it doesn't cover the entire frequency range. It's not, most of them, unless even when you get into the more expensive ones, generally don't go below 300 hertz. And my hearing loss is actually in the low frequencies in my left ear. So that doesn't help because I was, where I've lost it is the ability to hear basically anything under 300 hertz. The most of the hearing aids on the market can't reproduce anything below 300 hertz, so it doesn't help. So I understand the frustration, and I don't know the answer to your question in regards to tools that can do that real-time adjusting. So you're going to have to look for something along those lines. But it's also going to depend on your speakers and their ability, or your headphones and their ability to reproduce those frequencies that you're not hearing very well. Another note, there's no such thing as a person with good hearing that's the same as every other person with good hearing. Everyone's hearing is a little bit different. I understand what you're trying to say here, so I'm not trying to criticize that, but all I'm saying is that there's no golden reference standard, really, I don't think. It's interesting. Young people with very good hearing, for some people, sibilance drives them crazy. When they hear sibilance, it just grates on them. Other young people with very good hearing, it doesn't seem to bother them. I don't know if that's their ears being able to actually pick up those frequencies, or if it's the processing that happens in their brain that makes it harsh for one person and not harsh for the other. I don't know, but I would say just be careful to be caught in the trap of thinking that there's one kind of golden reference of a good hearing person. I think it's different for everyone, just so you're aware. Just so that if you do find a solution to real-time boost the frequency ranges where you're missing some of your hearing, that you're not assuming that you're getting this perfect hearing situation back again, and that there is such a thing as a perfect hearing situation. You know what I mean? Hopefully that makes some sense. It's a great question, but hopefully that helps, Maurice. And I feel for you. I've experienced some hearing loss myself, and so we all likewise should take good care of our ears in as much as possible. Next up, I have a question about 24, 32 bit rates and how editors process them. I record multitrack for my podcast at 24-bit, 44.1 kilohertz, and then open it in Izotope editor to copy tracks I need, sometimes switch files together and create separate files. First of all, I would recommend recording at 48 kilohertz if you can. Basically, all of the podcast players play back at 48 kilohertz without a problem. And it will potentially reduce sample rate conversion issues for playback devices. So that's one recommendation I would make, first of all. But that's not what you're talking about here. You're talking about sample rates. That's the 44 point. Well, yeah, you are talking about sample rates, actually, 44.1. So anyway, when you copy the track to a new file in Izotope, it shows 32-bit, 44.1 kilohertz at the status bar when I save it as a mono, and offers 32 as the default option. But when I drop such files into Logic Pro for editing, it converts them probably to 24-bit before starting the import. It takes some time. But when I save the files as 24 right from Izotope, sometimes I get conversion in Logic, sometimes not. Then you convert it to 32-bit from Izotope to 24 in Audition, and it works in Logic without conversion every time. So there's a bug in there somewhere. It's either on the Izotope side or it's on the Logic side, or something's going on there. Here's what I would recommend. So here's your question. I guess I just want to keep 24-bit at every step in the process, but something is wrong here. Is it an Izotope bug or a feature, or is it just me getting it all wrong? Here's what I would do. When you save from Izotope, I think what you're doing is exporting, where it gives you this ability to change and then to use some sort of dithering, whether white noise or noise shaping or whatever it is. I would not do that. I would instead just file save. But it sounds like you have a workflow that's a little bit unusual where you're somehow copying into a new file that's then setting it to 32-bit. If you just open a file that's been recorded, it should be in the sample or the bit depth that you recorded it in. So it should be in 2444.1 in this case. And then if you just file save, it should keep it in that. So I would try that first of all. I don't know what's going on. Izotope is doing some magic of some sort, it sounds like. I don't know what it is. And I don't know if that magic is a bug or a feature. But there's some thoughts that hopefully maybe that will, if that can work with your workflow, I think that can solve the problem there. So hopefully that's relevant. And thanks for that question. Next up from Adam. I think, is this the last question? No, we have a couple more. Long one here. First of all, that 688 I got is sitting in an Orca bed. So you're talking about the Sound Devices 688 mixer recorder, and it's sitting in an Orca sound bag. That's great. What is your power distribution for your audio gear when making out with lavs and mixer? How long does a single battery last? I use, as I mentioned before, I don't know if you can see this very well. There's my battery distribution system. It's a remote audio BDS V4. And then I also use high-Q batteries that have they're 98 watt-hour batteries. And they last me, depending on what I'm powering, usually a dual channel receiver, wireless receiver, plus my Sound Devices 633. I'm usually getting about 4 to 6 hours, closer to 6 usually. So that was your question. That you said, I'm currently beta testing a battery vest solution my father created for me, basically using an ammo vest and loading it up with lithium-ion batteries. Full charge of one vest lasts over 20 hours of continuous use. Mixer, receivers, phantom, boom. That's awesome. I think your dad and you may be onto something if you want to sell that. So there's always a trade-off. The more battery capacity you have, the more weight you're carrying. So it's a trade-off, but 20 hours of continuous use sounds pretty nice. I'm okay with this 4 to 6 hours. That usually gets me up to lunch in a production day, and then I change out batteries, and that gets me through the rest of the day, usually. If you're doing 20-hour days, I would caution you. You're going to burn out at some point. That's not good for your health at some point, but if it's only occasionally, I guess that's, totally understand. But anyway, that sounds great. It could be a really commercializable. You could commercialize that idea if you can start manufacturing it. So that sounds cool, Adam. Good. I would be interested to see if you guys do start selling something like that. Next up, Andre. My question is about sound repair software. Which one is best to invest in? I'm glad you brought that up. I've obviously been showing Izotope RX in this particular episode quite a lot. I use that as my main audio repair software. However, very important, Izotope RX is for audio repair and sweetening, but it's not for mixing. So you still need a solution for mixing your audio. I use Adobe Audition for that. You can see here. I would actually use multi-track mode for that. So let's just create a multi-track. Let's find a different place here. Okay, so multi-track. So I can layer in lots of tracks here. So if I'm mixing a film, I would need an interface or a digital audio workstation that does something like this. We talked about Izotope RX, the pricing. I showed you the website. So for audio repair, I use Izotope. For mixing, I use Audition. I actually just recently changed my subscription to Adobe's Creative Cloud. I used to get the full Creative Cloud. I now only get Adobe Audition. I haven't been editing in Premiere for about 4 years. I use Affinity Photo for photo editing now instead of Photoshop, and I hadn't been using any of the other apps. So I used Lightroom, but not very much because I don't do a ton of photography anymore. So for me, it made more sense just to get the Audition. So I am actually open to looking at other digital audio workstations other than Audition, but I haven't found one that has both the waveform view editor and multitrack in one, and I really like the combination of the two. However, I've been increasingly frustrated with Audition because it's gotten crashier lately. It seems like when I start to do a lot of heavy multitrack editing and mixing, it's crashed quite a bit. So I don't have the perfect solution, but that's what I'm using right now. So there's the answer to your question, Andre. All right, next up from Troy. He talked about he went to South Korea and recorded some Buddhist temple bells. And the sound wave from the bell recording would be a great source for creating sound effects, but needs some cleanup first. How would you approach a simple cleanup of this file? Namely, de-emphasizing the background noise while emphasizing the sound wave from the bell. I would generally do a little noise reduction on the top end, then compression to help with the clipping of the initial bell strike, and normalizing. Any other thoughts? Yes. So this is the recording of his bell. We're not going to play it back, but I just wanted to show you what it looks like visually. So yeah, there's a little clipping right here. It's not bad. You could use the declipper. So if I come into Effects and choose Diagnostics, I can use the declipper process to fix that. It's not terribly bad, so you can easily fix that. I don't think I'd do any compression, personally. So what I did notice, though, if I look in the spectral view here, what's interesting is that the majority of the bell seems to be at about under 1 kilohertz. I'm not positive what this other repeating sound is, but it almost sounded like it's either the bell, the sound of the thing that holds the bell, where the bell is kind of swinging back and forth. So it's like the straps that are holding the bell. I can't tell, but it actually stopped here. So I don't think that's what it is. And then it started again pretty prominently at a lower frequency. So I'm really not sure what that is. What I'm saying, though, is that if this is not part of the bell and you want to get rid of this higher frequency stuff, you could use a low-pass filter. So you could come up into Effects, Filter and EQ, use the parametric equalizer, and you could use a low-pass and roll this back and actually cut a lot of that out. So here, for example, let's get rid of the high-pass for now. If I apply that, watch what happens. It actually gets rid of a lot of that. So, you know, you'd want to fine-tune it and choose what frequency you want to cut down to and make sure you're not cutting out any of the bell by using your ears. But that is one thing you could do. I would, you know, it's always tricky. Get this back open here. It's always tricky with something like this, the bell. You'd probably want to do a high-pass filter. Otherwise, when it plays back on certain people, you know, if people don't have really good playback systems and they can't reproduce those low frequencies, it can start doing weird things. So you might want to cut some of the very lowest frequencies under maybe 40 to 50 hertz. And then you could use some denoising from there. So there are some thoughts on how you could work on that, Andre. That sounds like a pretty interesting project. Or sorry, Troy. So there are some thoughts on how to do that. And that is the full set of questions for today. I apologize to my brother Kerry for not answering his odd question, but he's just trying to make things funny, and he's usually successful at doing that, so thanks for that. Anyway, get out there, make some great sound, and we'll talk to you again next week.